Hello, and welcome to the webcast from the Biblical Files of Dr. Mack. I'm your host, Dr. Mack. We are moving into the book of Obadiah. I was just sharing with my friend that Obadiah is one of those short, deceptive books. You know, it has only one chapter and 21 verses. However, they are packed. We will continue our presentation today of women in the Bible, and we're going to go and do something a little bit different. We're going to look at Obadiah through the eyes of Rebekah's legacy. And we will be coming from the book of Genesis as well as the book of Obadiah. We're starting with the 22nd chapter of Genesis and going all the way through for Rebekah. Anything dealing with Rebekah to chapter 36. Now, part two of our presentation today, we're going to be looking at blacks in the Bible, and we will do a review, actually two reviews, of how the book of Obadiah is perceived in other countries, the interpretations they see. And this review is God's wrath and judgment on ethnic hatred and the hope for victims of ethnic hatred, and that will be the implications for Africa. And as I was doing this, preparing it, I also found something very similar regarding brotherhood and how Obadiah reflects that in Nigeria. So we have a threefold task today, and we're pretty excited about it. We want to start looking at the Messiah in Obadiah and work our way back. We're going to be talking about the kingdom, the apocalypse, and the interpretations there are in the book. So today, Obadiah offers God's remnants the future hope of the Messiah's return. And it would appear that we are doing legacy first, but it just gives me a point of reference. The book of Obadiah remains difficult due to its brevity and its apocalyptic language and its moral questions about justice. So, those were the three things I focused on as I went through. It's difficult, but the manifestations that you get out of the textual layers, the content, the theology, the various interpretations will give you the challenges, and you will enjoy the key content as you read through twice. So it is important to notice the book of Obadiah, the importance of God's remnant. Now, we've been using this word remnant for quite a while, and these are those who believe in the original covenant. Although they are years removed, they are referred to as God's remnants. Even the major prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, all talked about these people. There is an apocalyptic level of enmity for Israel and Edom, and this is where we really get into Rebekah's legacy. Those were her children. They were her children, and we'll talk about it. We have Esau and we have Jacob. And thirdly, we'll take a look at the final justice for the nations. Now, when I read it the first time, not when I heard it earlier in my life, but when I read it this time as something new and fresh, the word nations meant anyone who was not a believer at that particular point. They didn't believe in what was going on. So we're going to do an analysis. We'll share the interpretations, and we'll start off by talking about the prophet Obadiah. So we've already talked about how brief it is, and that Edom, anytime we see the word Edom, we are talking about the descendants of Esau. And anytime we hear the word Judah or Jerusalem, we're talking about the descendants of Jacob. So Obadiah was specifically chosen to be the carrier of this message because he was, in fact, an Edomite um, who had converted to Judaism. There's not a lot we know about him, but we did know that Obadiah, who dwelt among two wicked people, um, and did not learn those ways, but chose to go a different way, who understood the prophecy of the downfall of Esau, and we learn that that was part of the message. In fact, most of the scholars refer to the book of Obadiah and the prophet himself as a message speaker. You know, he had this message to say, he said it, and that was it. So the descendants of Esau lived and ruled in a region called Mount Seir, known as Edom. The people of Edom were a continuous adversary of the Jews in the land of Israel. What is interesting, though, is that Obadiah speaks of the doom that will befall Edom in the day, in the day of the Lord, the day to come, the day of doom. And we've heard that before. We heard it the last time, I do believe, in the book of Amos, and prior to that, in the book of Job. This is not unique to Obadiah because a number of the other prophets, major and minor, have spoken about this day of doom. So the places that we're talking about today are not as they were on the original map, and we know that because we're talking decades and many times before. But it is interesting to note that the Romans destroyed the second. They destroyed the second temple, and the European nations, they were continuously on a path of persecution and torture for the Jews, and they used the term Edom. But what we have to talk about today is a vision. In other words, we have another book that is prophetic. It is apocalyptic and it is prophetic. And some scholars simply refer to it as the vision of Obadiah. And it begins with what might be mockingly called a statement directed at Edom's arrogance. So, notwithstanding their self determination, God's going to bring them down from their high place, and they consider themselves to be above. Now, this is interesting. When we're talking about something or someone being high, well, the Edomites lived in the cliffs, on a mountainous area, but they will be overrun by the enemies, because they in turn had backstabbed their allies who were the Israelites at one point. At that time, it will lose both its wise and its mighty, and they will be ridiculed and become a poor nation again. I found it interesting that there's a covenant. There actually was a covenant treaty between these two at one time. It didn't last because of things from the past, but Obadiah was blessed with the ability to see far into the future. So he was able to tell of the future wrongs of Edom, which would earn them retribution. And that retribution was going to lead to destruction and exile because the Jews had already, well, they already were going to experience this type of thing by the Babylonians. The Edomites stood by and happily watched the downfall of Israel and the exile of his people. Um, uh, you know, he watched the exile of the people being taken into captivity. Excuse me. There was not even a trace of kinship that might have been expected from a nation who were, in effect, cousins of the Jews. Because they were in this high place, this high dwelling place, um, they could see, but they participated on the wrong side in many cases. So the prophet is saying that the day is near when all the evil done by Edom will be returned um, to them. And this is going to happen. That you can't see it now, but in the future, this is going to happen. But something is certain, something is near, because it is the promise of the God. It is the promise of God. And that not only will the Jews return to their rightful land and their holy place, um, Mount Zion, they thought of it as the holy place, but they will also expand their territory into the lands of their former enemies. Talked about this earlier, the 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 fall of the nations, what's going to happen, when the day of doom draws near. And these are the kinds of things that We have to understand and recognize it. So it was all the evil deeds that they had done, and it applies only to those whose evil deeds are like those of Esau. And some of you are going to say, where is Esau mentioned? Why are we going back that far? Well, in order to get where we need to be, we need to take a look at the antecedent action. How did we get to this place? How did we get to having the descendants of Esau um, be not worthy of merit or of any type of resurrection? Well, I love this phrase that I found in there. The forest provides the axe's handles. As I was going through, I saw that, and it didn't do anything for me at first, but it did later. Um, the connection between Obadiah and his prophecy about Edom was due in fact that he himself was originally an Edomite. So the ancient writers talks about um, the case, having a case like this where the people say, from the very forest itself comes the handle of the axe. The descendants of Edom was the one found most suitable to prophesy its downfall. Now, when we get down, and I'll just say it now, when we get down to the characters here, we're going to look at it in a narrative point of view. It was not only the Edomites who needed to hear this message of Obadiah, it was also the Jews who needed to hear the message of Obadiah. And that's what Obadiah tried to do. So the prophecy is a bitter cry for vengeance against Edom and its pride and its crimes. So Mount Esau in Edom will be occupied and it's going to be ravished by an enemy, while Mount Zion will be restored to its former sanctity and security. That triumphant refrain of the Israelites will be heard. The kingdom of the Lord, the opening verse of the prophecy, are very similar in part to the oracle against Edom in Jeremiah 49th chapter, um, verses 9 and 14 through 16. And we're going to find that one of the ways that Obadiah wrote is that he included, just as several others did, he included the words and the knowledge of those who had written before. Now, was he a contemporary? We had so many people who were named Obadiah. So there are scholars who said he was, there are scholars who said it wasn't, but the point is he had the knowledge. He was aware of what the others had written, and he was aware of uh, the language that was being used. So let's take a very quick look at this short chapter. Edom's fall is decreed in verses 1 through 7. Edom's betrayal of Judah is told in verses 8 through 14. And then Edom's fall and Judah's restoration in verses 15 through 21. There are others who block it differently, but for our purposes today, we will use it thusly. Now, who wrote the book of Obadiah? Well, we believe that Obadiah, and those scholars believe that the prophet Obadiah received this vision and he wrote this short book. Although one prophet named Obadiah was an official during King Ahab's reign, we're going back to 1 Kings 18th chapter, verses 3 through 16, um, as it appears in the scripture. But there were at least 12 men by the name of Obadiah. But the minor prophet who we believe penned the book likely did so after the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And we're talking back, King Nebuchadnezzar. And we're looking at 586 BC. He spared no words on background details about himself or his family, and he dives right into the meat of the impending destruction of Edom. So there's been so much discussion regarding the authorship of Obadiah, but we know several things. He was a literate, educated Israelite. We know that he apparently, being an Edomite, converted over to his belief. and that he resided in Judah, and that he witnessed one of several attacks on Jerusalem. Now, scholars believe, that he was born before the temple's destruction in 587 BC. So, limited information about him. His writing is very powerful, although it is very succinct. So, nothing is known, very little is known um, about other things, his other writings, his life background. But we do know that he was a prophet who spoke against Edom, a neighbor and a rival of Israel. And we can approximate the date, um, be- because the Edomites apparently took advantage of the helpless people of Judah and Jerusalem. And we can take a look at verse 11 of this short book, and then we can go over and look at Psalms 137, verse 7. So the relationships and the rivalries between Israel and Edom are reflected in oracles against Edom. And yes, we'd had them twice before. We had them in Isaiah 34th chapter, and we had them in Ezekiel 35th chapter. And in the stories of their ancestors, the brothers Jacob and Esau, going back to Genesis chapters 25 through 33. So we have the context. Let's take a quick look at the themes. It's a short one, so you wouldn't expect to find a lot of themes in there. But um, we do have an overriding theme, and that's very important as we go through. What holds it together, this particular story, and this fall of the northern kingdom to Assyria in 722 BC. The Edomites rebelled against Jerusalem in that time period, and we find that in Second Chronicles, uh, 21st chapter, verses 16 and 17. Now, there's always a dispute regarding the date, and we can feel that some of this goes all the way back to 400 BC, long after Babylon took over and the Israelites returned to their land. So when you're reading this, or when you're doing extra biblical reading of this, you'll have the opportunity to do extra biblical reading, and that will give you these ancestral dates that we have here. Um, but Obadiah may have written it sometime between 586 BC and 553 BC. Nice range in there. And it becomes post-exilic writing. Now, the Edomites descended from the line of Esau, going to Genesis 25 and 3. Isaac was the son of the patriarch Abraham, and he had twin sons, Esau and Jacob. And the eldest Esau had the birthright to his father's inheritance and blessings. But Jacob usurped these through trickery. Jacob became one of the fathers of the Israelite nation, and Esau became the father of the Edomites. So throughout history, the Edomites held a grudge against the Israelite nation. This compounded when King David subjugated them under his rule. Eventually, they revolted, and from the contextual clues in Obadiah, they appear to not only take possession of Jerusalem when it falls to the Babylonians, but they failed to give the Israelites military support when they needed it. Just take a look at that 11th verse. They gloated over their demise. And in the 12th verse, and betrayed them to their enemies. Now, because of this, the same will come upon them. Their pride will bring them low. Their enemies will betray them, and others will pillage the land. There's emphasis there that the Edomites actually uh, would assist the ones who were invading um, Israel at the time. They would help the Israelites, be captured, or they themselves would take them. But they would go into the cities and pillage what was left, or they would move into the city itself. Because of this, the same thing. Pride is going to bring them down low, and the enemies will betray them, and others will pillage their land. But I want you to keep the mental picture of their living on the cliff, on this very high cliff. And they were militarily bright, and the men of Timon were considered to be some of the wisest at that time in history. So the theme that we're going to be looking at is the captivity for a while. God brought them back to Jerusalem and they rebuilt. This is after that. This is contrasted with the people of Edom who ended up cut off and decimated forever. God does not forget his people. That's your thing. Even when other nations scorn and pillage them, he brings them back home and he brings dry bones back to life. What a wonderful way to look at that. There's another one too. Edom served as a warning to whoever chooses to let pride overtake their thoughts and their actions. So you could also look at this as a story, a narrative regarding what happens, the sin of pride. What happens with that? There was invasion, there's violence, and it's a very turbulent history here, and it has a long one. To shorten it, one another and an overarching theme, God will restore his people. Secondly, God will judge those who hurt his people. We have heard this in several of the prophetic narratives that we've taken a look at. We've already talked about the genre, the prophetic book of prose and the apocalyptic book uh, with this major purpose. So when we're reading it, we have to note that Obadiah 1b, um, we have to note that it is considered to be an example of oracles concerning the nations. So there are so many symbols here. We I sort of enjoy it a lot. We have the specific uh, s- symbol of like the locusts and the dragons, but Obadiah um, is still apocalyptic without those images. He's able to do with words what others did with something that could be identified. And this idea of all nations runs in through the entire 21 verses. Now, there is, well, we talked about it earlier, there is intertextuality in that we mentioned already Jeremiah 49, but we have Psalm 2nd and 12th. Um, we have that as a reference. And as we go down, we'll find the book of Joel as a reference, which was easy to remember because we just finished that one. Um, and then we can go on down and it can be connected to Amos 9th chapter in the 12th verse, going forward, Malachi, first chapter, verses 2 and 5. It was just it's interesting to see the interconnectivity. Um, we already know that they knew of each other, they studied of each other, and they believed. Now, the setting for Obadiah itself is is basically after the destruction of um, of Jerusalem, and the Lord is angry with them and their descendants. We will talk briefly in Genesis 25th chapter 21 through 26. We will talk briefly about that shortly. And we already talked about who the audience was, and this gives us a chance to go back a little bit. Now, I used the title of Rebecca's legacy. Now, the word Rebecca, the mom's not mentioned in the book of Obadiah, but let's go back. Um, Rebecca, there's some lessons that we can learn from her. Um, Rebecca in the Bible is one of the most prominent women in Scripture. We know that. After Sarah, she is the second matriarch, you know, that we have in the story of Genesis. And in the beautiful narrative itself, it describes how she becomes Isaac's wife. She gives birth to two sons after years of barrenness, and she gains the primary place in the lineage of her younger son, Jacob. He is destined to become the ancestor, his uh, to become the ancestor of all of Israel. Now, there is something we don't want to overlook. Rebecca, in my opinion, was deceptive and manipulative in the lives of her sons. She had a favorite. Her favorite was Jacob, and her husband's favorite was Esau. So she was a beautiful, intelligent daughter who she was the great niece of Abraham um, and the sister of Laban. And Rebekah married Isaac, um, the son promised to Abraham and Sarah. Now, we've already talked about the birth of them. And when she was pregnant, and when she had her talk with the Lord, he told her that she would be the mother of two nations. But he also told her the one who the the one who came out first, who was Esau. Now Esau basically means red, because he was red and his hair was red. But Jacob is the one who came out holding onto his heel, you know. So Rebecca, basically in the ancient Hebrew language, her name would have meant to tie firmly, to noose. So it's related to the fact that she was beautiful and that she was captivating. And you do remember the story that um, he lied to keep other men from looking at her, but she is considered one of the notable characters in the Bible. So in Genesis 24:16, we find that story, the continuation after the death of Sarah, and we go on down to the eighth verse. There's the journey where the serpent prayed that he would be able to find someone that would be suitable to his master. Going on down to verse 12, and we have this what I like to call sort of an inkling of what he wanted to find in this woman. Let this be a young woman to whom I shall say, please let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels. We're talking a 10 camel entourage here, going loaded with gifts, and he gives her the nose ring, gold nose ring. He gives her the gold bracelet, and the parents agreed to it. And she travels this long distance back. And then there's the marriage, the birth of the sons. But when you start choosing favorites, but God knew all of this was going to happen. When you start choosing favorites, it puts you into what you have to do to make one come out over the other. So it's fascinating to see how Rebecca fooled her husband Isaac. Now, she knew Esau was the firstborn son and had the right over everything, but she still manipulated things for Jacob, the younger of the two, to receive the blessing. Now, you have to go and remember that Esau, as he was growing up, he was the outdoors person, and Jacob was the one who was more like his father, who was contemplative. He thought of the community as a whole. So, um, although Isaac was older, he was having trouble seeing. Some scholars believe that he lived to the age of 132. Um, Between 132 and 137 years old, and he thought it was time to bestow his blessings because he knew Esau was the firstborn. Now Esau had already pilfered off, he couldn't give the birthright to Jacob, but he was hunting one day and he was hungry and tired, and he found Jacob and he was making red lentil stew, and I'll give you my birthright for a bowl of this stew, but Rebecca knew you couldn't do it that way. It had to be done by tradition and custom. So she helped. Uh, the father asked Esau to go and go and hunt and bring back something, you know, wild, that he liked. He loved stew and stuff like that. So Esau went off, but at the same time, Rebecca asked Jacob to bring two good young goats so that she could prepare food, also delicious food for your father, quote unquote, as he loves. So he did that. But it wasn't, Rebecca wasn't thinking about a stew. She was thinking about how she could deceive this nearly blind man who was dying. So what she did, she dressed Jacob in Esau's clothing, and she put the hairy skin of the young goats on his hands. So when Dad felt on him, he felt hairy because Esau was a hairy. And as he approached the father, and Jacob um, Isaac requested that Jacob come near so that he could be sure it was Esau. Um, Isaac remarked, and he did go near, and the deception was successful, and that is how birthright was stolen. Now, see, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. And we're down in 27, we're getting down to 31 in there. Uh, so Isaac realized he was deceived, and he told Esau, "Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing." But he said, "Your brother came and he's taken it away." So there's a series of events that will come, which is the beginning of what? The rivalry between Jacob and Esau, or really Esau and Jacob. Now, I often wondered what happened because I heard the story when I was very young, the stealing of the birthright and all of that, what happened. So when the dad died, um, and Jacob actually became head of the tribe, and and Esau stayed for a while, but he had to leave, so they went in different ways. So one of the lessons that we can learn, marriage is built on love and faith, okay, but there should not be deception in it. We must let God carry out his plan, and that and God heals our hurts with new relationships. So then Isaac brought her to the temple. Okay. And we go on into this. So God always answers prayers, but not always when we expect them. We used to sing the song in church, He may not come when you want him, but he's right on time. So we are now, very quickly, I just wanted to bring Rachel in there because I'm saying it's her legacy. The situation, the manipulation that she did, that that sort of started, it sort of like the root of where we are. It sort of started what we're dealing with now, where Obadiah is reminding the Edomites, as well as, we have to remember that, as well as the Israelites, um, that God is going to take care of the things that are done wrong. Um, and that those kinds of things, God does that, and He punishes the nations when they do these kind of wrong things. Now, I said the manipulation and the deception of Rebekah, but what I also want to remember that she had some good traits because she did believe in the Lord, but she did cause this schism between brothers that should not. But God knew. God knew. So she had the three phases of her life. She had the bride, and she had the wife, and she had the mother. And if you go back and you look at and pull out the characteristics, the, the the basic positive characteristics, you find that she was a servant and she did believe. And she knew, she knew that she had done wrong. She knew. And if you put the two side by side, Jacob and Esau, what you can do, okay? So Jacob was set up to carry on the covenant promises that God had made to Abraham and Isaac. So, so later in life, Jacob had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. His name was changed to Israel after he wrestled with God. He did wrestle with the angels. Thus, the nation of Israel traces its covenant heritage back through Jacob, back to Abraham. So, some of the key facts that we want to remember about Jacob: he was the son of Isaac and Rebekah, and he had the twin brother Esau. He purchased Esau's birthright, and he tricked Isaac into giving him his firstborn blessings. He had the 12 sons. His name was changed. We mentioned that. And God confirmed the Abrahamic covenant with him. So, as the mother um, of Jacob, Rebekah played a pivotal role in the covenant line that brought about the nation of Israel. Truly, she was the mother of this great nation through her son Jacob. Esau, father of the nation of Edom. So Rebekah's other son Esau fathered a nation too, the nation of Edom. After Jacob tricked him out of his birthright blessings, Esau moved to the region of Seir, which is where we are now. It puts us back in our setting where we are now. And he took wives from among the Canaanite. We'll see that in Genesis 36. His descendants became the Edomites who settled in Edom south of the Dead Sea. Now, here are some key details about Esau and his descendants. So he was the firstborn son of Rebekah. He sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew. Um, he tricked his father into giving him his brother's blessings. He became angry and he moved to a region of Seir. And if you want to go back, that's back in Genesis 32 and 6 and 36 and 8. He took the Canaanite wives and his descendants became the Edomites. The Edomites established the kingdom of Edom. Okay. While the Edomites were not part of the covenant people of Israel, they still trace their lineage back to Rebekah through her son Esau. As the mother of Esau, Rebekah played an important role in the history of Edom as well. So truly, she was the matriarch of two great nations that came about through her sons Jacob and Esau. Now, she nursed Jacob, father Isaac, in his old age. As Isaac advanced in years, he became totally blind and feeble. So, according to tradition, Rebekah lovingly cared for her husband in his old age. She remained devoted to Isaac, helping feed and nurse him as his health deteriorated, which you can find in Genesis 27, chapter, first verse. Through Isaac and Rebekah favored, although they favored different sons, Rebekah continued fulfilling her wifely duty of providing comfort and support. Her tireless service highlighted the selfless aspect of her love in her marriage. Now, there's a further mention of Rebekah after Isaac's blessing of Jacob. She likely died before her husband, and she is not recorded as being buried along Isaac. According to Jewish tradition, Rebekah died at the age of 133 when Jacob was living in Haran. That's in Genesis 29. She was buried in the cave in Hebrew, where Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Leah, and Jacob were also laid to rest. That's in Genesis 49. So I wanted to share that so we can get into where we are now. So the Lord has sent a message speaker to say, when you did not remember your brother, when you did not do what would have been done, here's a word we could use. There's a covenant brotherhood. When you didn't adhere to that, you know, these are the things. Remember, God said He was going to punish all of the nations who had stood against the Israelites. These are the things that you're being punished for. If you go through each of the 21 verses, you will hear Obadiah say, "This is what you did do." This, you know, basically calling them out is what we call that. You know, this is what you did, and even though you are here, even though you feel you have all the military strength and all the advantage, it does make you prideful, and you really did not. You didn't even try to help your brother. Actually, um, your sin started, when you decided to do nothing. You decided to do nothing. Then you progressed to pride over Judah's distress. Soon they took advantage of their brother Judah's misfortune and laid hands on their southern. So we're going now. You stood at the crossroads. I do love the way it goes, and there's a lot to be said for it. Uh, and it's a lot to be said that goes applies to us today. There was a problem with just doing nothing, but he complicated it. He made it even worse by using what he considered to be his prideful thing. But that was not going to happen. So on the day of judgment, there would be dark retaliation, and the Lord would have the last word. Only the first rays of light of justice appear here, but the rays of the light of justice will eventually add up to a kingdom of light in which all nations will be judged justly for their eternal throne in heaven. So um, that's where we are with that. That was a Hope College's quote. Dr. Marty Dunbar refers to Obadiah as a messenger, and this is a recent article that was really only published in 2024. He likened it to a basketball team that never really won anything, but it was so bad that the coach had to get in and play in two games. So the narrative of Esau and Jacob, found in the book of Genesis, sets the stage for this latter history of the descendants. So the older twin is considered sometimes evil. There are others who like to tell it as a tale of two brothers, which it is. But at this point, the brothers are not doing as God would have them to do. And in the midst of that reality, there is no compromise. There should not have been. And then we get to the point that God's faithful remnants, as both of them should have been, um, following the covenant at Sinai and going through the line of Abraham, should have been easy to do. But there was hatred and there was dissension. There is an apocalyptic situation going on, full of enmity between the two brothers that lasted in all the way through to their descendants. There's a historical enmity going on, and that has to do with the location and the action during the time of war. So there is a covenant brotherhood that should have existed and will exist for the remnants of those who believed in the Lord. But for those who don't believe in the covenant brotherhood, there will, will be this day of doom, this day of doom. So there is gospel of hope and salvation within the book of Obadiah. So Obadiah um, challenges um, the application of the oracle. He's telling them what will happen, and there will be a way to get back to the kingship of David. We have to go back and we look at Deuteronomy 28, 9 through 10, and Amos 9, chapter 11 through 12. We have all of this. Then Obadiah underscores God's grace for redemption from the historical perspective. So Jacob was designed to be the heir of the covenant God made with Abraham. This was by design. Makes no mistakes. So there's a way to protect the legacy. And Obadiah's message, like Esau, um, you can't be indifferent to God's purposes. You have to wake up before it's too late. And pride cannot make you blind because you know God still brings hope. Although the lives of Jacob and Esau took different paths, producing very different destinations for them and for their descendants, there's still a time when there will be God. If you look at the 18th verse, Jacob will be a fire and Joseph a flame. Esau will be stubble, and they will set him on fire and destroy him. There will be no survivors from Esau. The Lord has spoken. So you have to guard your heart with the decisions that you make and look at why you make them. What are some life lessons that we can actually get out of this tiny little book? Well, we can take a look at it. God can restore anything that is broken. Messing with God's people has consequences. Ob- Obadiah demonstrated a boldness and a proclamation of God's judgment against Edom. He did that. The pride of your heart is deceptive. We have to remember that. Obadiah's dedication to his prophetic calling shows unwavering faithfulness. Obadiah's challenge to Edom highlights a commitment to justice. And we should remember that all will stand before God, which should humble us as we go through. We must remember that healing and justice go together, and that is what the message was. If nothing else is remembered, healing and justice go together. We have to remember as we close it and we look at it that the book of Obadiah, although there are several translations of it, all of them basically have the same message. Some words have been translated differently, but if we take a look at the theological approach to the study of the book of Obadiah, if we look at the historical circumstances that we have there, we will find a parallel. We will find a parallel to our life today. We will find a parallel for those who are liberationists, those who are womanists or feminists, or any other thing you want to call yourself. But all of it will be there if you go back and read it. Now, as far as moving into the blacks in the Bible part, let's take a look at how Obadiah is perceived. It is important that we look at this and we understand that God's wrath and judgment on ethnic hatred and hope for victims of ethnic hatred in Obadiah and the implications for Africa. There was ethnic hatred there between the brothers, and it stemmed from some actions that, when you look into this last article, you'll see that the Africans do not blame Rebekah. They blame both parents because each had chosen the son. And that happens often. But because of that behavior, look at the lineage, the legacy that is left. The ethnic hatred that in many of the lives on the continent of Africa, it causes victims to be left out without hope. It causes them, according to the author, to experience this kind of racial hatred. You have to take a look and see that there was a plan in the Bible that the hatred, the ethnic hatred there allowed destruction, and it still allows destruction. Um, a nation against a nation, a brother against a brother. The misfortune of the Edomites who used their advantage, they used their advantage to participate in the destruction of a brother nation, at least a brother nation. There were victims of ethnic hatred in Africa that should uh, be able to learn from the lessons of Obadiah, from the punishment of those who take advantage of the conditions of others, rather than working with them, but just as the Edomites did. But there is a day of doom that has to come. What the author does, he goes in and he takes a look at Obadiah, and one by one, he points it out. He talks about the meaning of the word brother, and it still applies. He goes all the way back to Genesis 13 and 18 when we have that relationship between Abraham and Lot, and then we have the relationship between Jacob and Laban, and it just goes right down the line all the way to Emelish, and that kind of relationship exists today, even though the Esau, Edom, Jacob, Israel, and Judah situation. Obadiah follows the ancestral narratives in the book of Genesis that presents this confrontation and goes into the book of Numbers. So even where there have been reductions, the story remains the same. There are situations coming forward where we have the ethnic things against the nations who encountered or were with Israel and Judah, or well, Judah and Jerusalem. We have the fights and the carnage that was the result of that. The oracle tells that it has to stop. So the Africans here, according to the author, is saying that we have to remember that we are our father's children, our mother's children. They are both sisters and mothers. And the people of the towns and the villages will have to learn to live and to work together. He is from Ghana. And I said there was also one from Nigeria. But we have to take a look at what we have. This author, Gimpa, He takes a look at the oracles and he breaks it up. Lastly, he talks about the oracles concerning Edom, um, God's wrath and judgment on Edom, as we'll find in verses 2 through 15. And he goes verse by verse, or he blocks them, just as they were written by Obadiah. And he applies it to a current situation in the country. I also like the fact that when we're talking about pride in this particular article, he talks about it. Um, he talks about it as not being a psychological issue, but a sense of one's own God-given place in the world that affirms one's achievement and evaluates them justly. Now, what a lovely definition of pride! So we have to look at it ambition and ruefulness, and we have to think of not liquidating our neighbors, but working with our neighbors. We have to work with them, we have to work through them, we have to develop a kind of relationship which will allow us to understand how each other works and maybe work it out. He talks about, it goes back to Jeremiah and what he wrote regarding the hatred and nation, because he too had to go through it. I mean, he went to the point that Jeremiah went to the wilderness, or talked about going to the wilderness to escape. I'm telling you what the Lord has said, you're not listening. But Obadiah identifies Edom with the patriarch Esau and the brother Jacob. So the theme of brotherhood then comes to the fore uh, in following the oracles. These are oracles. They are visions of what's to come in the future. God had done what he has always done. He has sent a messenger, and a messenger to tell it and to break it down so that it would prevent future betrayers. Uh, Edom basically betrayed the covenant. You notice what he said earlier is that they did not come into it uh, as total followers, but they did continue keep many of the many of many of the beliefs that they had been given. So on that day, in verse 11, that refers to when Babylon ransacked Jerusalem. It was on that day that the usurpers and the tyrants and the violent nations and the foreigners and the strangers came in. They did nothing to stop it. Absolutely nothing. Nothing to help. So the attitude there was wrong. It indicates that the enmity that had existed all those years, going back to the young adulthood, the stealing of the birthright, the stealing of the blessing, um, all of that had been part of the substance on which the descendants of Esau had built. But God had something else. They had not supported, they had not remembered. So they too were going to be victims of the doom that was to come. So in verse 21, we take a look, and it summarizes with special reference to Edom. It talks about the theme of conquest, which is expressed in the word to govern or to judge. So, what we have here is military victory, which we've already said earlier. We have the idea that because I am where I am, I can defend myself against all enemies because I am high. I am a high person. Geographically, if I can defeat anyone who's trying to get up here and defeat me. The Lord had a different plan for that. So Israel will once again do what? Dominate Edom, politically and theologically. So we have all of this going on. So the victory is not merely one of nationalistic reawakening, but it's a symbol of the divine sovereignty. It's an affirmation that reveals that God's chosen people, and if they leave the judgment to him and the enemies, um, for the enemies who have wronged them, then it will be right. So, what are the implications of these different groups? You have to commit to meeting the needs of other people. There was no effort to commit to anything other than that I will destroy. God's wrath and judgment on ethnic hatred Well, the book of Obadiah clearly shows that God wrath and judgment came upon Edom from mistreating, quote unquote, a brother nation. God exercised authority in punishing Edom to the extent, that the survivors were going to be left for her. Now, please notice the survivors are the remnants, but the remnants are the ones who still believe. So African ethnic groups need to learn a great deal of lesson from this particular story that Obadiah has. Um, as he did to Edom, the tables will turn around and inflict upon those who have mistreated ones who have not been treated fairly. I do love the last three books. We've talked about those who were oppressed and not given, but still believed that God was there for them. The hope for the victims of ethnic hatred, he talks about that. I love the idea that we have this vision of Mount Zion and the house of Jacob. So God turned the misery of Judah into joy and restored her to God's plan for the people. So there was hope for those victims who had suffered hatred. As the book of Obadiah concludes, he talks about it as a word from God, not words from God, but a word from God. So all of this is collective that he has written and what he has said. He said that there would be a moment where things will be recurred and all will be done. And the people of this uh, today, the author of this book, Kappa, says that ethnic hatred has created and continues to create a lot of problems in Africa. But he believes too that these terrible things that are being done, that are cruel and inhuman, and while neighbors stand idly by watching the oppressed people, he believes that this promise of hope will be fulfilled and dominion will belong to God. So such groups who are should consider themselves independent, but they are reminded who has the actual control, and that actual control is in God. I hope that you have enjoyed today. Um, I've talked until I'm dry, but I would like to share with you at the end of here a smile prayer and to invite you to join us for the next webcast as we look at the book of Jonah. So, this is a prayer to live out the lessons that we can learn from Rebekah in the Bible. Lord, I know that you are Almighty God of all. Help me today as my will gets in the way and my plan stands between your plans for what should happen today or in the future. Please give me eyes to see things the way you do and allow me to be a vessel for you to work through. May you be glorified in my actions, relationships, and thoughts today. Help me to keep the eyes of my heart on you as I engage with people around this world. Each phase is an opportunity for your mighty work. May your grace empower me so that in all my actions today, I can feel the power from you. Guide every thought toward worshiping at your feet because only you are worth it. In your name I pray. Amen. Thank you.